The year was 1831, and the port city of Veracruz stood at the crossroads of empires, trade, and restless ambition. Ships arrived daily from Havana, New Orleans, and Cadiz, their sails crowding the horizon like white wings. The streets were alive with the sounds of merchants haggling, sailors laughing, and carriages rattling over cobblestones. Salt from the Gulf mingled with the scents of roasted coffee, tobacco, and exotic spices. It was in this climate of opportunity and anonymity that a man known as Don Esteban Morales first set foot on the docks. To the casual eye, Esteban was everything one might admire in a gentleman. He was well dressed, his coat clean despite the dust of travel, his boots polished to a near shine. His Spanish accent carried a lilt of refinement, suggesting education and long journeys across the Atlantic. His dark eyes sparkled when he spoke, and his smile seemed to carry warmth even in moments of silence. In a city where many men lived rough lives of labor and salt water, Esteban's polished manner marked him as someone of distinction. But what Veracruz did not yet know was that appearances can be the first mask of deception. When asked about his past, Esteban spoke only in fragments. To some, he claimed to have studied law in Madrid. To others, he said his family once held vineyards in Andalusia before falling on hard times. He hinted at fortune lost in wars and hinted again at fortunes waiting to be reclaimed. The contradictions in his stories went unnoticed at first because few pressed him for details. In a port city where travelers came and went with every tide, mystery often added to a man's allure rather than diminished it. He presented himself as a man of discipline and ambition. He attended church regularly, bowing deeply before the altar candles. He carried himself with courtesy toward officials and was quick to offer assistance to neighbors. When dock workers fell ill, Esteban would bring them broth or herbs. He never failed to tip a servant generously. Soon, whispers of Don Esteban spread through the plazas. Who was this newcomer with noble manners and a heart so seemingly generous? Veracruz in the 1830s was a city hungry for stability. The Mexican War of Independence had ended only a decade earlier, and scars of conflict lingered in the streets. Families sought prosperity and order, eager to rebuild fortunes and reputations lost to war. Into this atmosphere walked Esteban, who embodied both safety and sophistication. He attended local gatherings with ease. At evening dances, he was the first to request a waltz and the last to leave the floor. Charming matrons with respectful bows and daughters with honeyed compliments. At taverns, he listened to men's troubles with the patience of a confidant, occasionally slipping in advice that made him sound wiser than his years. He praised Veracruz's beauty, its resilience, and its people, words that warmed local pride and gave him a place in every conversation. Soon, influential families invited him into their homes. His table manners were flawless, his toasts elegant, his stories laced with enough sorrow to evoke sympathy and enough triumph to inspire admiration. Yet not all were blind to the oddities that trailed him. Some noticed that Esteban never wrote letters in public, never received correspondence, and had no relatives to vouch for him. Others wondered how a man without business or trade connections seemed to carry money enough to dress well and entertain. When asked about his future plans, he spoke vaguely of investments, of possibilities, in land of partnerships, yet to be decided. Still, suspicion never hardened into certainty, for Esteban possessed the gift of deflection through charm. When questions cut too close, he would laugh, share a witty anecdote, and redirect attention to his listener. By making others feel important, he blurred their doubts. He was, in truth, weaving a net of influence, preparing the city for the darker chapters he intended to write. Esteban's greatest weapon was not merely his looks or his manners, but his ability to sense opportunity. He noticed who in town had daughters of marriageable age, who held wealth in trade, who owned land ripe for cultivation. He listened to gossip as carefully as a spy listens for codes. When Isabella Dort, the gentle daughter of a spice merchant, caught his eye, Esteban made his approach with the precision of a hunter stalking prey. But before that moment arrived, he knew he needed to appear not merely as a man of charm, but as a man of substance and respectability. He attended Mass more regularly than ever, presenting himself as pious. He donated to church repairs and visited the sick, cultivating the image of a generous benefactor. He made small loans to struggling neighbors, ensuring that many would speak of his kindness. Slowly, Veracruz began to believe it had gained not just another fortune seeker, but a man of honor and promise. By the end of that year, Esteban was no longer seen as a stranger. He was woven into the city's life, welcomed at feasts included in councils, whispered about as one of the most eligible bachelors in Veracruz. Mothers began to nudge their daughters toward him, fathers began to speak of potential alliances, and the church viewed him as a man of growing respect. But behind his polished manners and gentle smile lay cold ambition. Esteban was not there to build a future, he was there to harvest one. He had no trade, no lineage, and no business. His plan for advancement lay entirely in deception, seduction, and ultimately destruction. Thus, when the bells of Veracruz tolled the new year of 1832, the city celebrated, unaware that within their midst walked a predator cloaked in silk. The stage was set for betrayal, and the charming stranger was ready to play his part. The arrival of Don Esteban Morales in Veracruz had stirred curiosity, but within a year he was no longer merely a stranger, he was a man woven into the fabric of society. He had mastered the art of speaking just enough to inspire trust, offering just enough kindness to be remembered. Yet beneath his polite bow and practiced smile, Esteban carried ambitions darker than anyone could imagine. Among the families that welcomed Esteban was that of Don Rafael Dorte, a wealthy merchant whose ships carried spices from the Caribbean and silks from Spain. Dort was respected for his trade and envied for his fortune. But perhaps his greatest treasure was his daughter, Isabella Dorte, a young woman of gentle spirit and striking beauty. Isabella was known not for boldness but for her quiet kindness. She often accompanied her mother to church, where she helped distribute bread to the poor. Her modesty only heightened her appeal. To Esteban, she was not merely a woman of charm. She was the gateway to wealth and permanence in Veracruz. Their first meeting was arranged almost by accident, though Esteban had calculated the moment with precision. At a feast held in the Dorte home, he positioned himself where Isabella could not help but notice him. When they danced, Esteban's compliments flowed effortlessly, each word tailored to flatter without overwhelming. Within weeks, he was a regular visitor at the Dort residence, bringing flowers, reading poetry aloud, and praising the family's standing. For Don Rafael, the match was appealing. Esteban's manners spoke of refinement, his words suggested education, and his apparent piety reassured Isabella's devout mother. Though his origins were somewhat unclear, his conduct won over suspicion. What father would not be flattered by the attention of a distinguished gentleman toward his daughter? By midsummer of 1831, the engagement was announced. The city rejoiced, for it seemed the union of Esteban Morales and Isabella Dort promised prosperity and joy. The church bells tolled as they wed, and Isabella, radiant in her lace veil, was whispered about as one of the loveliest brides in Veracruz that year. The feast was grand, filled with roasted meats, sweet wines, and music that carried into the night. Esteban played the role of the devoted groom flawlessly, lifting Isabella's hand tenderly, thanking her parents with humility, and proclaiming his gratitude to God for such a blessing. The Dort family felt their daughter's future secure. Yet while the city celebrated, Esteban's mind was already calculating. He had gained what he desired: access to wealth, influence, and the trust of one of Veracruz's most respected families. The first weeks of marriage passed pleasantly enough. Esteban escorted Isabella through plazas, presented her with small trinkets, and attended mass at her side. But soon, Isabella's health began to decline. At first, it seemed nothing more than fatigue, an unusual weariness that doctors attributed to the summer heat. Then came the headaches, the bouts of nausea, and the trembling weakness that left her confined to bed. Esteban, ever attentive in public, played the role of the worried husband. He summoned physicians, provided broth, and sat by her side, murmuring words of devotion. Yet those closest to Isabella noticed something troubling. The medicines and drinks Esteban prepared for her seemed to worsen her condition. When her mother questioned this, Esteban brushed it off, insisting that his remedies came from knowledge passed down in his family. By autumn, Isabella's once bright complexion had dulled. Her hair lost its luster, her body grew frail, and her voice weakened to little more than a whisper. The Dort household, once filled with laughter, sank into grief and confusion. As Isabella's illness deepened, suspicion stirred faintly among her relatives. Some whispered that perhaps the marriage had cursed her. Others wondered if she had inherited some hidden weakness. None dared to accuse Esteban directly. His devotion appeared too convincing, his sorrow too eloquent. He prayed aloud at her bedside, his voice trembling with emotion, tears glistening in his eyes. In truth, every act was a performance. Behind the veil of sorrow, Esteban was measuring his next steps. He knew that Isabella's death would not only free him from the burdens of marriage, but also deliver a portion of her dowry and inheritance into his hands. Each dose he slipped into her drink brought him closer to his goal. On a cool evening in late November, Isabella breathed her last. Her passing was recorded as the tragic end of a young life cut short by mysterious illness. The bells of Veracruz tolled again, this time not for celebration but for mourning. Esteban played his role with chilling perfection. At the funeral, he stood beside Isabella's coffin, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling as if with grief. He kissed her forehead one final time before she was lowered into the earth, drawing gasps and tears from those watching. To all appearances, he was the picture of a broken-hearted widower. Don Rafael and his wife clung to him in their sorrow, grateful for his devotion to their daughter, even in her final moments. The city sympathized, some even admiring Esteban more than before for his dignity in tragedy. Few men, they said, carried grief with such quiet strength. And so, suspicion dissolved into pity. The Dort family, though devastated, gave Esteban the portion of Isabella's dowry that remained in his care. He accepted it with humble words, vowing to honor Isabella's memory. But behind closed doors, Esteban allowed his mask to slip. With Isabella gone, his mind turned not to mourning but to opportunity. He had tested his methods, secured wealth, and silenced doubts. What had begun as a gamble had ended in success. If one marriage could deliver such gain, why not another? Why not many? The tragedy of Isabella Dort was not merely the loss of a kind and innocent young woman. It was the first step in Esteban's calculated descent into infamy. Veracruz had welcomed him as a charming stranger, but now, cloaked in the sympathy of widowhood, he was free to continue his path of deception. And thus, while the Dort family prayed at Isabella's grave, Esteban Morales began planning his next move. The city of Veracruz had wept for Isabella Dort. Her passing was mourned as the tragic death of a young bride, and her husband, Don Esteban Morales, was admired for his apparent loyalty and grief. In public, he wore black for months, walked with bowed shoulders, and spoke softly of his beloved's memory. Many praised him as a man of rare devotion, one who had endured sorrow with dignity. But behind the mask of mourning, Esteban was already setting his sights elsewhere. His first marriage had brought him money, status, and the trust of Veracruz's leading families. Far from deterring him, Isabella's death emboldened him. He had tasted success through deception and discovered how easily pity could disguise his ambition. In the spring of 1832, Esteban began visiting the household of Maria Fernanda Lopez, a widow in her late 20s. She was not wealthy in coin but possessed something equally valuable: land just outside Veracruz, acres of fertile ground where sugarcane grew thick and profits were steady. Her late husband had left her a modest but respectable fortune, making her a desirable match for any man who wished to secure stability. Maria Fernanda was different from Isabella. Where Isabella had been gentle and soft-spoken, Maria was known for her resilience. Widowed young, she had managed her estate with prudence, balancing accounts and dealing firmly with tenants. She was not easily swayed by charm alone. Yet Esteban, with his calculated persistence, understood how to break through her caution. Esteban began by presenting himself not as a suitor but as a confidant. He spoke of his grief, of the loneliness that haunted him since Isabella's passing. He did not press his interest at once, but instead allowed Maria to believe she was helping to heal his broken heart. He praised her intelligence, admired her management of her estate, and positioned himself as an admirer of her strength rather than just her beauty. Maria, accustomed to being treated as vulnerable because of her widowhood, found Esteban's respect flattering. Slowly, her initial reserve softened. He accompanied her to church, advised her on trade matters, and offered his protection against men who sought to exploit her as a lone woman. By midsummer, whispers began again in Veracruz. Perhaps Don Esteban would marry once more. The wedding of Esteban and Maria Fernanda was smaller than his first, but no less celebrated. The city pitied him less now and praised him more, remarking that it was good to see him rebuilt after sorrow. Maria's family approved, believing she had chosen a man who would value her strength and guard her estate. For Esteban, the union was simply the next step in his design. Where others saw love, he saw opportunity. His mask was flawless, attentive, gentle, devoted. Maria, reassured by his affection, allowed herself to believe she had found not only companionship but security. It was not long before shadows fell once more. Within months of the wedding, Maria began to suffer ailments eerily similar to those that had struck Isabella: persistent nausea, fatigue, and stomach pains that no doctor could explain. She dismissed them at first as stress from her responsibilities, but her health continued to decline. Esteban played his role as he had before, hovering at her bedside, bringing her specially prepared tonics, insisting that his remedies were superior to the physician's. Maria's servants noticed his vigilance, but none dared question his methods. He was after all her husband, and he bore himself as a man desperate to save his beloved wife. Yet behind closed doors, his mind was calculating. Each day of Maria's decline brought him closer to the control of her estate. Each dose of the arsenic laced tonic was a step toward her inevitable end. Unlike Isabella, Maria had a circle of relatives who were less easily swayed by appearances. Her sister Dolores began to question the speed of her decline. She was strong, Esteban, Dolores confided to neighbors. Too strong to wither so suddenly. But Esteban, skilled in deflection, soothed these suspicions with his eloquence. He spoke of his own sorrow, of the cruelty of fate, of the trials God sometimes places upon his children, and for a time his words were enough. The physicians themselves, baffled by Maria's symptoms, concluded that her death was the work of some hidden ailment rather than human hand. The suspicions that might have saved her never hardened into action. By the end of the year, Maria was bedridden. Her once bright eyes dulled, her voice reduced to whispers. Esteban continued his performance, sitting beside her bed, praying aloud, shedding tears when visitors came. To them he appeared the perfect husband, stricken once again by the cruelty of fate. One winter morning, Maria breathed her last. Her death was recorded in parish records as a tragedy, but not an unnatural one. The physician spoke of weakness, of possible fever, of ailments too mysterious to name. Her estate passed into Esteban's hands with little resistance. In the eyes of Veracruz, Esteban was now doubly marked by sorrow. To have lost one wife was tragic, to have lost two was almost unbearable. Men clasped his hand with pity, women praised his steadfast devotion. Priests commended his faith in suffering, but some whispered uneasily. Twice widowed in so short a span, 2 wives dead of illnesses no doctor could cure. The questions hung in the air, yet no one dared voice them openly. To accuse a grieving husband was to risk scandal, and without proof, suspicion was left to die in silence. For Esteban, Maria's death was proof of his invincibility. Twice he had struck, and twice he had escaped unscathed. His wealth had grown, his influence deepened, and his reputation, though shadowed by tragedy, was still one of respect. He had perfected the mask of grief so completely that even those who doubted dared not challenge him. But ambition is a hunger that grows with feeding. Esteban could not stop. If 2 marriages had brought him wealth, what might a third bring? His heart knew no love, only the cold arithmetic of greed. And so, even as Maria's grave was still fresh, Esteban Morales began to seek his next bride, unaware that his confidence would soon lead him to a family not so easily deceived. By the close of 1832, Veracruz had become accustomed to the sorrowful figure of Don Esteban Morales. Twice widowed in as many years, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man tested by God. His black attire, his solemn prayers, and his polished manners earned him pity, even admiration. For many, he was a tragic soul who, despite wealth and refinement, was destined to walk hand in hand with misfortune. But to Esteban himself, the deaths of Isabella Dort and Maria Fernanda de Lutipez were not divine trials but victories. Each marriage had delivered wealth and security, and each wife had fallen neatly into the grave he had prepared with poison. His confidence grew into arrogance. He began to believe he was untouchable, a man clever enough to outwit both doctors and suspicion. It was this arrogance that led him to pursue his third wife, and ultimately his downfall. Among the families of Veracruz, none were as respected as the Romeros, whose lineage included soldiers, landowners, and merchants. Their influence stretched from the docks to the countryside, and their reputation for honor was unshakable. It was here that Esteban set his sights on Catalina Romero, a young woman of striking beauty and fierce intelligence. Unlike Isabella, she was not sheltered, and unlike Maria, she was not easily swayed by sorrowful stories. Catalina was known for her wit, her quick tongue, and her unwavering loyalty to her family. She was a woman who commanded respect in her own right. For Esteban, Catalina represented not just wealth but also prestige. To marry into the Romero family would secure him power beyond money. It would root him in one of the most influential clans of Veracruz. And so, with the same practiced charm, he began his pursuit. At first, Catalina kept her distance. She found Esteban's tragic history suspicious, twice widowed, twice bereaved by mysterious illnesses. Her instincts warned her that something about him was amiss. But Esteban was relentless. He showered her with attention, sent letters full of poetry, and spoke with humility about his losses. More than once, Catalina voiced her doubts to her elder brother, Captain Alejandro Romero, a respected officer in the local militia. Alejandro was protective, wary of men who sought to exploit his sister's charm and the family's fortune. But Esteban, skilled in disarming suspicion, visited Alejandro personally. He spoke of honor, of rebuilding a broken life, of his wish to find solace in a family as esteemed as the Romeros. In time, even Alejandro began to soften. Esteban's manners were impeccable, his words persuasive, and his sorrow convincing. Catalina, though still cautious, agreed to the courtship. Within months, talk of marriage filled the air. The wedding of Esteban and Catalina was a grand affair. Unlike his previous unions, this one was celebrated with the full weight of Romero influence. Nobles, merchants, and soldiers attended, and the church bells rang louder than ever. To many, it seemed as though fate had finally granted Esteban a chance at happiness after so much grief. Esteban himself basked in the triumph. He had married into the most powerful family in Veracruz. His enemies, if any remained, could say nothing now. He had achieved what he had always desired: wealth, status, and the protection of one of the city's strongest clans. Yet greed is a hunger that does not rest. For Esteban, Catalina was never a true companion. She was merely the next obstacle between him and absolute control. 3 months into the marriage, Catalina began to experience symptoms chillingly familiar to those who had known Isabella and Maria. Nausea, stomach pains, and unexplained fatigue crept into her daily life. Esteban, true to form, insisted on preparing her medicines himself. He brewed tonics, added powders, and urged her to trust his remedies rather than the doctor's. But Catalina was not like his other wives. Strong-willed and sharp, she quickly noticed that her sickness worsened after taking his concoctions. At first, she doubted herself. Was it mere coincidence? Was grief clouding her judgment? But as her condition declined, her suspicions grew. Captain Alejandro Romero had watched closely from the start. Protective by nature and skeptical of Esteban's too perfect manners, he had remained wary even after blessing the marriage. When Catalina's health faltered, his suspicion hardened into vigilance. Alejandro confronted Esteban more than once, demanding explanations for her sudden decline. Esteban, ever the actor, deflected with ease. He spoke of hidden illnesses, of God's mysterious tests, of his own endless grief at watching another wife fall ill. To the public, he was the image of sorrow once again. But Alejandro was not convinced. Unlike the Dort and Lucapez families, the Romeros wielded both wealth and military power. They had resources to investigate what others dared not question. Quietly, Alejandro ordered the family physician to examine not only Catalina, but also the powders and tonics Esteban provided. The results were damning. In the small packets and jars Esteban kept so carefully, the physician discovered unmistakable traces of arsenic, a poison well known for its slow, agonizing effects. The symptoms matched Catalina's decline perfectly. The evidence was brought before Alejandro, who wasted no time. He confronted Esteban directly, demanding an explanation. Caught off guard, Esteban tried to deny it, but the Romero family's resolve was unshakable. Catalina, weak but alive, was moved into her brother's care. For the first time, Esteban's mask began to crack. In choosing Catalina Romero, Esteban had miscalculated. His previous victims had been surrounded by families who either trusted too easily or lacked the influence to challenge him. But the Romeros were different. They were powerful, vigilant, and unwilling to bury their suspicions in silence. What had seemed his greatest triumph, marrying into prestige, had become his downfall. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that some families could not be deceived, no matter how polished the mask of charm. Esteban Morales, once the charming stranger who fooled an entire city, now stood exposed as a predator. His third marriage was not a new beginning, but the fatal mistake that would unravel his entire web of lies. The discovery of arsenic in Catalina Romero's tonics sent shockwaves through her family. For weeks, suspicion had whispered in the corners of the Romero household, but now suspicion hardened into certainty. Don Esteban Morales was no grieving widower, but a murderer. For Captain Alejandro Romero, Catalina's elder brother, the revelation was both fury and vindication. He had mistrusted Esteban from the start, but even he had not dared to believe the man capable of such cruelty. Now the truth stared him in the face. His sister had narrowly escaped the fate of Esteban's previous wives, and only vigilance had spared her. Alejandro wasted no time. Accompanied by soldiers of the local militia, he stormed Esteban's residence one evening in late 1832. The confrontation was swift. Esteban, seated at his desk writing letters, looked up in shock as armed men filled the room. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded, his voice calm but his eyes flashing with alarm. Alejandro placed the small packets of arsenic on the desk before him. "The meaning," he said coldly, "is murder. Twice before you buried wives under the guise of grief. You will not bury my sister." Esteban's confidence faltered for the first time. He stammered, reaching for excuses, medicine, remedy, misunderstanding, but his words rang hollow. The soldiers seized him, binding his wrists. Crowds gathered in the street as word spread the city's most admired widower, the man who had charmed two families into silence, was now accused of poisoning his wives. Veracruz buzzed with rumor. Some refused to believe it. How could the polished, eloquent Esteban Morales be guilty of such monstrous deeds? Others, emboldened by the Romero family's accusations, began to speak openly of their suspicions. Isabella Doherty's relatives remembered how suddenly she had withered, how Esteban had insisted on preparing her drinks. Maria Fernanda La Pepez's sister recalled her suspicions, silenced at the time by Esteban's convincing grief. Now, with fresh eyes, their stories formed a pattern too perfect to ignore. The authorities ordered the exhumation of Isabella and Maria's graves. Physicians, guided by the Romero family's findings, examined the remains. Despite the months that had passed, traces of arsenic lingered in their bones. The evidence was undeniable. Both women had been poisoned. The whispers hardened into certainty. Esteban Morales was not the tragic victim of fate. He was a calculated predator. The trial of Esteban Morales drew crowds unlike any other. The courthouse overflowed with citizens eager to witness the unmasking of the man they had once admired. Priests, merchants, widows, soldiers, all came to hear the evidence. The prosecutor painted a chilling picture. Esteban, they argued, had entered Veracruz a stranger, weaving his way into families through charm and deception. He had courted wealth and influence by marrying women of fortune, only to poison them once they were securely his. Isabella Doherty, gentle and kind, had been his first victim. Maria Fernanda Lopez, resilient yet trusting, had been his second. Catalina Romero, strong and sharp-witted, had nearly been his third, but her family's vigilance had exposed him. Witnesses took the stand. Servants testified to Esteban's insistence on preparing food and drink. Physicians explained the effects of arsenic, aligning perfectly with the symptoms of Isabella, Maria, and Catalina. Relatives recalled how Esteban's grief always seemed more polished than heartfelt, more staged than sincere. When asked to speak in his defense, Esteban relied on the same charm that had carried him so far. He claimed innocence, insisting that he was a victim of misfortune, a man cursed by fate. He wept, he prayed aloud, he called upon God as his witness. But this time, his tears failed to persuade. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimonies too consistent. His performance, once flawless, now appeared as nothing more than a desperate act. After weeks of proceedings, the magistrates delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts of murder. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some shouted for justice, others wept for the women lost to his ambition. Esteban Morales, once the darling of Veracruz's society, was sentenced to death by execution. The punishment was not merely for the murders themselves, but for the betrayal of trust and the poisoning of innocence and the deliberate manipulation of families who had welcomed him as their own. On a grey morning in early 1833, Esteban was led to the plaza where justice would be carried out. The air was heavy with anticipation. Citizens filled every corner, some to witness justice, others out of morbid curiosity. Esteban appeared dressed in simple garments, his once polished coat replaced by plain cloth. His face, once smooth with confidence, was now drawn and pale. Yet even in his final hours, he attempted to play the role he had perfected. He addressed the crowd with trembling voice, proclaiming his innocence, blaming envy, fate, and misfortune. But no one listened. The city that had once pitied him now saw him for what he was, a murderer cloaked in courtesy, a wolf in gentleman's clothing. As the executioner carried out the sentence, silence fell over the plaza. For the first time, Esteban Morales was stripped of charm, stripped of deception, and forced to face the justice he had so long evaded. In the days that followed, Veracruz buzzed with reflection. Families who had once admired Esteban now recounted his faults, seeing clearly what they had once ignored. Mothers warned their daughters against being dazzled by charm alone. Fathers spoke of vigilance, of the duty to question even those who seemed most honorable. The Dort and Lopez families mourned anew, their grief sharpened by the truth of betrayal. The Romeros, though scarred by the near loss of Catalina, found solace in their vigilance. And for the city as a whole, the tale of Esteban Morales became a cautionary legend, a reminder that evil often hides behind courtesy, and that trust must be guarded with care. Thus ended the life of the man once called the charming stranger. His ambition had carried him high, but his arrogance had brought him low. In the end, it was not wealth or power that defined his name, but the justice delivered against him. For generations, the people of Veracruz would recall his story not with admiration, but with warning: beware the mask of charm, for beneath it may lurk poison. The execution of Don Esteban Morales in early 1833 did not end with the silence of a single man's death. It rippled outward, leaving an imprint on Veracruz that would endure for generations. His crimes had been extraordinary, not only for their cruelty, but for the way they had been hidden beneath a polished mask of courtesy and charm. Veracruz, a port city accustomed to strangers, had welcomed Esteban as one of its own. He had danced in its ballrooms, prayed in its churches, and dined at its tables. Families of honor had opened their doors to him, mothers had trusted him with their daughters, and priests had praised his devotion. That such a man could be revealed as a cold-blooded murderer shook the city to its core. For the Dort and Lopez families, the revelations were almost unbearable. They had not only lost daughters to illness, but now had to grapple with the knowledge that those deaths had been deliberate. Isabella Dort's mother was said to have fainted upon hearing that her daughter's grave contained traces of poison. Maria Fernandez's sister, who had long suspected foul play, wept with both sorrow and anger, sorrow for the life lost, and anger that her doubts had been silenced for so long. The Romeros, though they had saved Catalina from the same fate, bore their own scars. Captain Alejandro Romero's vigilance had prevented another tragedy, yet he could not escape the thought of how close his family had come to joining the others in grief. Catalina herself, weakened by Esteban's poisons, would take months to recover physically, and perhaps never fully from the betrayal. The city as a whole felt wounded, for Esteban's deception had not been limited to families alone. It had been woven into the very fabric of Veracruz's society. His story became more than one of crime. It became a parable of trust betrayed. On the Sunday following Esteban's execution, the city's cathedral overflowed. The bishop himself delivered the sermon, using the trial as a warning. Evil, he declared from the pulpit, does not always approach with the face of a brigand. Sometimes it comes clothed in fine manners, speaking gently, bearing gifts and shedding tears. The wolf does not always wear its own skin, it wears the skin of the lamb, and it is the duty of every Christian to see beyond appearances. His words echoed through the pews, leaving a lasting impression on those gathered. Many repeated his sermon for years to come, passing it to their children as both spiritual counsel and worldly wisdom. In the months that followed, Veracruz grew more cautious. Families who had once judged suitors by charm or pedigree now demanded proof of lineage, records of trade, and testimony of character from those seeking marriage. Fathers became more watchful, brothers more protective, mothers more discerning. Young women, too, carried the lesson in their hearts. No longer was a polished smile or elegant bow enough to inspire trust. They sought character over charm, sincerity over flattery. The story of Esteban Morales became a whispered warning at gatherings. Remember the Bigamist of Veracruz. See with clear eyes, not dazzled ones. As the years turned to decades, Esteban's tale was retold around hearths and marketplaces. Old men warned apprentices of it, not merely as a crime story, but as a lesson in vigilance and humility. Schoolmasters used it as an example of how unchecked greed corrodes the soul. Mothers reminded their daughters that appearances deceive, and that a man's deeds, not his words, reveal his nature. By the time the century closed, the story of the Lethal Bigamist had become part of Veracruz's folklore. It was no longer simply about a man who murdered his wives, but about a city that had nearly been fooled into celebrating evil as virtue. What then was the lesson? It was not merely, beware of strangers, for strangers passed through Veracruz every day. Nor was it simply, beware of charm. Though charm had been Esteban's greatest weapon, the true lesson was deeper. Evil thrives when people silence their doubts. Isabella's decline had stirred whispers, but her family's love of Esteban's politeness had silenced them. Maria Fernandez's sister had voiced her suspicions, but deference to appearances had muted her concerns. Only the Romeros, unwilling to be soothed by tears and courtesy, had pressed for truth. The people of Veracruz learned that vigilance is not suspicion for suspicion's sake, but a duty to family, to community, to truth itself. They learned that grief, when performed too perfectly, may sometimes be nothing more than theater. And they learned that trust must be earned by deeds, not borrowed through words. Long after the execution, visitors to Veracruz would hear the story recounted in taverns and homes. Sailors carried it across the Gulf, and merchants repeated it on their journeys. The name Esteban Morales became synonymous with deceit, a warning spoken whenever charm seemed too polished, whenever fortune seemed too sudden. Catalina Romero lived to old age, her survival proof that vigilance could overcome treachery. The Dort and Lopez families, though marked by sorrow, passed the lesson down to their descendants, ensuring that their daughters and granddaughters never forgot. For Veracruz itself, the saga became more than a crime of the past. It became a moral compass, reminding the city that appearances can conceal poison, and that justice, though delayed, always comes. Thus, the story of the Lethal Bigamist was not buried with him. It lived on, shaping the city's culture of caution, whispered to generations who never saw Esteban's face yet knew his name. His life ended in disgrace, but his memory endured as a warning. Charm without honesty is a mask. Wealth without work is a theft. And trust, once betrayed, leaves scars deeper than death. This was the lesson of Veracruz, etched not in books or monuments, but in the collective memory of a city determined never to be deceived again.